Welcome back to the channel. We are living the very worst era in the history of X-Men. X-Men have been around for over 60 years. It says something when this is worse than the Chuck Austin era, the Brian Michael Bendis era, the X-Men Colors era, and all the others. And here to talk with me about the 5 biggest reasons that this is the worst era in X-Men history is Doc. How you doing, Doc?
I got to give up reading this bullshit, so that makes me great.
Well, let's talk about the Krakoan era and why this is, without a shadow of a doubt, the very worst era in X-Men comics. Coming in at number 5, meandering / abandoned plot points. When House of X Powers of 10 came out, a lot of people were excited. They took the X-Men in a new direction, had some things set up to knock down the board. We've hit a couple of those elements here and there, and they've been pretty exciting. But for the most part, they've just been introducing new stuff that they don't pay off either.
It was exciting to find out how they were going to get to those points with Nimrod, the Phalanx, the AI coming online, the Chimeras and Sinister's doing his shit on Mars and all that stuff. And we've got payoff for virtually none of it. They haven't really built any of that stuff. Nimrod shows up like every once a year for like an issue or two.
That was the most exciting thing coming out of House of X Powers of 10 was when you saw that doctor who lost her husband and she reclaimed him and remade him into Nimrod, and then half of Nimrod, that was him, kind of sacrificed himself. And what was this Nimrod going to do, and what were they going to do? Yes, we do see Orcus every once in a while, but for the most part, they've slow rolled this storyline out for like 3 years now.
And the thing is, they're not even keeping it alive in subplots. They just like flash into it like once a year just to show, hey, look, a bunch of stuff happened over there. We ain't going to tell you fucking what. We're not going to mention it again. We're not going to build towards a major conflict. The closest thing we got was the Xavier and Magneto versus Orcus and Nimrod. We got a little bit of that and then nothing. They're just like, I guess we'll get to it eventually. But the fact is, that was the shit that most people were most excited for. They haven't gotten to any of it.
Yeah, it's definitely been really frustrating, especially when you saw the writing on the wall that this really wasn't going to go anywhere interesting, at least for a while. Another huge problem coming in at number 4, the terrible events that have launched out of House of X Powers of 10. I don't think any of them have really hit so far. Obviously, we had X of Swords. We had the Hellfire Gala a couple times. We're in Axe Judgment Day right now. We had Inferno, Trial of Magneto. They've done so many event series and big crossover events during this time, and I don't think a damn one of them has been worth anything.
They've had no lasting impact. They haven't pushed the narrative forward or advance it in any way. And they definitely, I mean, outside of maybe the first little bit of some of them, haven't really lit the sales charts on fire. They're not critically acclaimed. They're forgotten about before they're even done.
Well, and they're also promoting like 3 or 4 events while they're in a particular event.
None of these things are important, and none of them seem to matter, and they just won't stop them.
They're absolutely addicted to events. They need an event in a schedule, and they just throw an X-Men event in there without ever thinking about what's the impact, what's the big deal about this event. None of them have really landed, in my opinion. Number 3, and I think this would be a lot of people's number 1 choice, Living Magneto's Dream. I can't believe Charles Xavier has gone along with making the mutants a segregationist sex island community on Krakoa at this point, and he has never questioned himself or what's going on, and we know he's been manipulated, and he's never figured it out, but they just keep going along, and it just feels less and less like X-Men every single book.
This is not Xavier's dream by any stretch. And the fact is that he hasn't even acknowledged. It'd be one thing if he was like, we tried it my way for many years, but let's try it your way, Eric. But they haven't had any of that. It's just been, this is suddenly the new interpretation of Xavier's dream. And it isn't.
And we've seen him do some really skeezy stuff. Remember him trying to kidnap Franklin Richards, going and mind-wiping Reed Richards. Very evil stuff, very villainous stuff that you would imagine a character like Magneto would do if he had the powers of Charles Xavier. But Charles is pretty much a villain alongside Magneto, and I don't think the writers even realize it at this point. Magneto is not the hero of the story, even if he has a tragic backstory.
Granted, we've had a lot of cases of Xavier doing questionable, sketchy shit throughout the era of, the ages of X-Men. One big one would be the 1.5 team from the Deadly Genesis team. But this is not Xavier, and he would absolutely be questioning himself. And he even regretted the shit that he did.
Yeah, typically Charles Xavier is kind of like the heart and soul of the X-Men, really the guiding light. some people would say maybe Wolverine has that kind of a role as well, but they've absolutely abandoned it in this era, and I think that's why it doesn't feel like X-Men. You can't deny that one of the big reasons that today's era of X-Men is awful is because of the bad creators. There's just so many of them. This comes in at number 2. That tells you how bad our number 1 is going to be. Leah Williams, Beat Ayala, Titty Howard, Victor Laval. Jerry Duggan is now the primetime, like, flagship comic book writer on the X-Men. That tells you how bad it's gotten. Kieran Gillen was supposed to come over and be like a ringer for the X-Men team. I don't think he's brought much to the table as far as quality in X-Men. The only good writers that we've had that have done a good job in this era of X-Men, Jonathan Hickman, Zeb Wells, Chip Zdarsky, have moved on, and we're just stuck with all the leftovers.
I mean, there is not a single...
I forgot Steve Orlando. He's terrible, too.
Yeah. There is not a single competent writer. The most competent writer in that office is Jerry Duggan, and he still can't write himself out of a wet paper bag.
He's not terrible. He would be perfect if he was on the number 4 X-Men book, and then they put 3 really good X-Men titles out there, to where if you want some more, it's sitting there, and Jerry Duggan's not awful, but him being like the flagship creator tells you everything wrong with X-Men right now.
And the fact that anybody that was competent either got chased out or left of their own volition is very telling, because the inmates are running the asylum in that office. The editorial staff is either totally on board with it, totally incompetent about it, or totally impotent to rein them in and direct this line, or this is exactly what the fuck they want. I guess when you lower expectations to the point where Jerry Duggan can be a flagship writer, then Steve Orlando can write his bullshit over in Marauders, and everybody's like, fuck it, it's not much worse.
Well, it certainly doesn't speak well of Jordan White and his ability to identify talent they're going to work well in the X-Men. I think he's just going out there and doing favors like, you know what? Your career has amounted to absolutely nothing. Let's put you on an X-Men title so you can put that on your ledger, and maybe you can get some real work down the line again. I don't think any of this has to do with entertaining people, but I lay the blame solely on Jordan White at this point. Let's get to our number 1 reason. We talked about some bad things going on with X-Men, why none of it really works. It's hard to deny that the reason that it's so hard to invest in the X-Men right now is there are absolutely no stakes. You will see a character die and be resurrected the next page. It doesn't matter what kind of peril they're in. There's no emotional impact to any of this. The characters just have a free pass to keep coming back and coming back. So they're never actually in danger. There are no stakes whatsoever.
I remember getting towards the end of House of X, Powers of X. I'm like, during that, and they had the resurrection protocols and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, this is interesting. Short term.
You had to break them almost immediately.
Yes, you had to create this situation, and then you had to make sure that stuff was out of the book moving forward before it got into an ongoing,
and move on with your life.
Yeah. I mean, start slaughtering the 5. You had to do that before the end of that event, or else there was going to be a problem down the line. And guess what? They didn't slaughter them before the end of the event, and there's a fucking problem down the line.
Well, the worst part is, Doc, is any restrictions that Jonathan Hickman had put in place on Resurrection have essentially been lifted. You don't even have to be around from this era of X-Men. You can be 1 billion years old and they can resurrect you now. You don't even have to be a mutant anymore.
Whenever Hickman created it, you had to have had a recent backup. They have to be able to confirm that you're dead. It only worked on mutants. You had to have been alive when Cerebro was doing backups. So there was all kinds of limitations. Some random human that was a good friend of the X-Men died. They couldn't bring her back, him or her back, because they're a human. But over the course of the last 2 years, all of those restrictions have been removed. Trial of Magneto removed the when you had to be alive. I mean, fuck, they're doing it right now with mutants that aren't even born yet from 2099 over in Steve Orlando's stupid fucking book. There's absolutely no stakes. You just do whatever you want. If they wanted to just clone 500 Wolverines at once, they don't even seem to have a problem with having more than one existing at a time right now. And then just throw them as an endless stream at Orcus. They could do that.
They don't do any research, Doc. Remember that part where he had X-23 and all of a sudden she was resurrected and she had an animanium skeleton like Wolverine, even though she doesn't have one.
Yeah. They keep fucking those things up. And then when they get called out on it, they just retcon their own way out, like where, you know, they waited about 3 issues, which would have been about when Jerry realized it, and after he started getting called out on it, and then they're like, oh yeah, and they stuck a line of dialogue in Proteus's mouth.
Made a boo-boo. He was confused.
That he fucked it up. Look, no, you're just incompetent. You know, it's like playing a video game with, you know, after using an infinite life cheat code. It's not as fun of a game when there's no fucking challenge anymore.
Well, it's certainly not as compelling a story when there's absolutely no stakes. There's no danger. You know the character's going to come back. And then any restrictions that they did have, they just removed. Been absolutely terrible. I do want to say thank you very much to Doc for running down the 5 reasons that this is the very worst X-Men era of all times.
Thank you for having me, sir. And these guys suck.
Jonathan Hickman leaving the X-Men office was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for this era of X-Men. It's dead. They just haven't realized it yet. And Jordan White, the X-Men group editor, tried to spin it that Jonathan Hickman was always planning to leave and stuff like this. We know Jonathan Hickman left X-Men because it got so bad because of Jordan White. Definitely watch this video right here where I break it all down and make Jordan White look like a complete dumbass, because that's what he is. If you don't see it here, there's also a link in the video description.